Australia. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.
The question now is that the amendment be agreed to. I call the member for Indi.
Deputy Speaker, thank you. Colleagues, I want to start this speech with a story. The story took place about 21 years ago in a rural community in southern New South Wales. And I was working as a rural consultant and had been invited to this meeting to talk about service provision in country towns. And as we gathered the women together from the farms, we heard the story of a father. And he told how recently he'd had an accident on the farm. He had a child on his tractor, and the child was hurt, so he took the child to the local hospital for attention. And it was his mother, who was the nurse on duty at the emergency centre, who looked after the child. And the father told this story to a group of us country people who cared about service. And the father and the mother and the community said, what would it take for us to have childcare? What would it take for us so that a farmer, man farming on his farm, and the woman working in the local town could have their children cared for by professional carers? And that story so resounded around that community that they got organised, formed a committee, as you do in country towns, and began work on designing a service that would meet the needs of farm families in small rural communities for childcare. So, with some degree of déjà vu that I stand in Parliament today, 20 years after that report was written, Country Kids Who Cares? Childcare, a work-related issue for farming families, and say that many of the issues addressed 20 years ago are still unredressed by this legislation. So I'm particularly focusing my comments today on the Jobs for Families childcare package. And I want to make a plea to my colleagues opposite, and particularly to those who represent rural communities, to pay attention to this legislation, because I believe it fails to address the needs of, in particular, farm families, and it fails to address the needs of working parents in small rural communities. I have been working very closely with the Minister around these issues, and I would like to acknowledge and thank him and his staff and the departmental staff who have given me a lot of time and have listened to my concerns. And they have committed to me that they have paid attention and that in the development of the guidelines associated with this legislation that they will address my concerns. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, how sad it is that we have to pay attention to unwritten, unreleased guidelines and rely on the Minister who says, cross my heart, trust me, Cathy, we will address this, when we have legislation like this before the House today. And I want to take the opportunity to say that's not nearly good enough, that in designing childcare packages for all of Australians, we need to put the needs of rural and regional Australians front and centre. And I have to say how incredibly disappointing it is when people say, well, we'll make special provisions for those disadvantaged people, or we'll make special provisions for those ones who just can't get to a childcare centre. And I say rural and regional Australia should never be regarded as disadvantaged, and particularly the farming families of rural Australia should never be regarded as disadvantaged. We are mainstream parts of this country. We work really hard to produce the commodities that make this country flourish. And as families who work to do that, we deserve to have our needs front and centre of this legislation. And sadly, we're not. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, I've got a few things I want to talk about. One is, how does government go about in making sure that rural and regional Australia is front and centre? How do we design services that meet the needs of farming families? And how is it that we take into account the particular needs of this particular group that I'm speaking for today? And I want to take the opportunity just to read a couple of case studies from this report, Country Kids Who Cares, prepared 20 years ago. And I want to quote Nerida. Nerida is a dairy farmer, and she said, "Dairy farming is constant work. We milk the cows twice a day for 9 months of the year. Some dairy farmers milk 365 days of the year. It begins in the early morning, starting around 6, and goes to 8 or 9 when you come home for breakfast. Then off to do the day's farm work, with milking again in the late afternoon. The day's farm work usually finishes around 7 p.m. These hours make it difficult to get people to come in and mind the children on the farm, but it's also impossible to get to a childcare centre if there was one. Nerida's neighbour would occasionally look after the children. She'd charge X dollars an hour. But the nearest childcare centre was 20 kilometres away, a round trip of 40 kilometres. And Nerida says, "I refuse to jag children out of bed so early in the morning and take them 40 k's for childcare." Another little case study was from Marilla. Marilla and her husband have 3 children, and they live in a community that's 100 kilometres away from the nearest childcare service. Marilla has no extended family who lives in the area, and when necessary, she tells me her husband or neighbours provide childcare. But it's difficult to ask a neighbour to look after 3 children when she's already busy on her own farm and has 2 or 3 children of her own. So she says, if it's necessary, I split the children up between neighbours, but each trip involves me taking them to 15 or 20 kilometres. Marilla says when shearing or doing tractor driving on the farm during cropping, they employ a local woman to mind the 2-year-old. But trips to town to appointment for business, they can be a logistical nightmare. Sometimes I have to worry for a week as how I can possibly get all the jobs done to be back in time for the school bus. I normally only go into town once a week for shopping and farm business, and then it's incredibly stressful. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, what happened as a result of this report was a childcare service was designed to specifically meet the needs of rural and farming families, and it was called mobile childcare. And mobile childcare was based in the adult education, the Albury-Wodonga Community Childcare Hub. It now employs 50 qualified staff, and they've got cars, and they go out to the communities and they work in halls. So they've renovated the community halls, they've got them all licensed, and the mothers and fathers of these rural communities can now take their children to the local hall for occasional childcare, long day care, after-school care, depending what the need is. Now, this has been a magnificent service in my local community that's really met the needs of the community. But sadly, with the changes that are going to come in, that local service says it can no longer do what it needs to do. Now, the Minister has said he will address it. But what is so sad about this particular bit of legislation is it hasn't taken best practice into account. It hasn't taken the needs of agricultural industries into account. It hasn't taken the needs and the work that these really skilled childcare workers. So they're extraordinarily skilled people. They not only are qualified childcare workers, they go into community, they take information with them, they provide support support to the farming family, and if it's appropriate, they can refer to other services that are available. They do community development when there's a need. They can talk about how else needs of families can be met. So these workers are in fact community builders. They in fact save the government hundreds of thousands of dollars by making our rural communities work better. And sadly, they don't fit this model. So what's wrong with this model? This model is based on what we call centre care. This model is really, really good if you live in a town and you've got a centre based. The model's no good if you live in a small country town and you don't have a critical mass to support a centre. And many, many of our communities are not large enough for a centre-based childcare. So I really want to make sure that the minister actually understands that what he is doing meets the needs of a lot of people, for sure. But there's a really significant people in rural and regional Australia who are being marginalised by this change, and it is such a pity. I want to just talk a little bit about one of the things that happened in my adventures with trying to fix this up, because you can imagine the angst that came to my community when they heard that the childcare legislation meant that their wonderfully loved service was no longer going to be provided. So they've been lobbying me, they've been lobbying the member for Farrer, anyone that would listen. So one of the things we did is we put a number of questions in writing through the system. Question number 25, budget-based funding services. And we asked the minister to tell us what impact study had been undertaken with this legislation, so that at least we knew that when the government was making the changes, it did it in full knowledge of the impact of this change. And the answer came back, question number 25, answer number 5. A regional Australia impact statement was not required, as discussed with the Department of Infrastructure and Regional Development, because the circumstances of all families, including families in regional and remote areas, were taken into account in developing the package upon which the legislation is based. And a regional Australia impact statement was not required, because it said the needs of all families were taken into account. Well, I would like to say somewhere, someone is not telling the full truth, because the communities that I represent are loud and clear in saying that their needs have not been taken into account, and they're being asked to transition. And transition is a magic word. My community say to me, transition to what? The minister tells me we'll put a granting process in place, and communities can apply for grants to do transition. And I say, Minister, there's nothing to transition to. There's no services in these towns. There's no centre. If we don't have mobile childcare services, there's nowhere to go. And while we all of us love the opportunity for a grant, those of us who live in rural and regional Australia, and let me say I've had 20 years of it, applying for grants, of demonstrating innovation, of demonstrating how my particular circumstances warrant special treatment. And it's a horrible way to have to justify what is a mainstream service for the city people, which is childcare. Why should rural and regional Australia have to apply for a grant and special conditions and demonstrate innovation when we've got as legitimate needs for childcare as everybody else? So I was so disappointed to read that answer. And I have to say to the bureaucrats involved, don't do that to me again. Undertake rural and regional impact statements, and particularly to the Department of Infrastructure and Regional Development, if you are undertaking major changes to the way fundamental services are provided in Australia, you must, as a matter of good governance, do the research to show how it's going to impact, and then put in place the necessary changes to make sure that there are no unintended consequences that disadvantage a huge sector of the population. And to that end, I have moved at an earlier time the Charter of Budget Honesty Statement. And that charter, if we could bring it on to debate in this House, would do exactly that. Would make sure that every major change has an impact statement so that we understand how it's going to impact on our communities. So, in bringing my comments to a close and foreshadowing that I will be making amendments in the third reading stage of this legislation, I'd like to acknowledge and thank the minister. He's certainly given me a really good hearing, and I'm sure he understands my issues. I'd like to acknowledge the public servants that we've met who have given a lot of time and energy for this. But I'd particularly like to acknowledge the work of Anne Bowler, who's the National President of NAMS, which is the National Association of Mobile Services, who has worked in a voluntary capacity so hard to have these issues addressed. To Anne and all your colleagues, we began the fight 20 years ago. We won't give it up now. We know that rural and regional Australians deserve excellent service, and I will be your voice in this parliament to make sure it happens. And I'd also like to acknowledge the work of Rodney Wangman, the Chief Executive Officer of the Albury-Wodonga Community College. Rod, you've been the auspice body of the Mobile Childcare Centre. You've seen it through 20 really good years. So it's my commitment we're not going to let it go. We've got a really good model, and we will continue to work with the government to make sure that in the long term we find a system that actually works for us, a place-based system, a whole-of-family system, a children's services system that actually acknowledges how important our children are, and we don't make them an add-on, extra, grand, innovation, apply-for system. So in bringing my comments to a close, this fight has really just begun, and I'm not going to let it go.
Has expired. The question now is that the amendment be agreed to, and I call the member for Ford.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I rise to speak in support of the